first year in secondary school, I had a friend who was in the drum corps, and they used to carry their drumsticks down their stocking at that time. And I was always pestering him for a shot, and it became apparent to me that I did actually enjoy playing with them. So I bought a pair. And from there on, it just progressed from a pair of drumsticks to a practice pad to a snare drum, and slowly but surely the kit built up. But it wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't a case of rich parents take you out and buy an entire drum kit. No way. So I had to learn it in bits and pieces, shall we say.
And what got you into jazz specifically? 'Cause
one man, his name was Gene Krupa. There was nothing else. Graham and I were at school together at the same time, and we used to have big arguments, friendly, about the jazz we liked. And my jazz was always Benny Goodman, and he scorned that. You know, Louis Armstrong, I hate to say this now, wasn't really quoted as far as I was concerned. He was just another also ran. But the expansion into the general jazz of six-piece or thereabouts or even less had not occurred to me. I was only interested in the big band and Gene Krupa, and that was what led me in. And from there on, I decided I needed some lessons, and got quite a lot from a person who I've never heard of since, Tommy Cairns, who taught in Keating School of Music up in Waterloo Place. And that was where I met Ronnie Ray, for instance. He was taking bass lessons at the same time. And he was next door. You could hear his bass practicing as well. He got lessons from Jimmy Luke, who was a person who I played with later on as well. And I got lessons from this Tommy Cairns, who I never saw in my life again. After that, for a while, I got lessons from Charlie Welsh, who was the drummer with Old Bailey's Jazz Advocates at that time. And that was a very handy lead as well, because in time, Charlie Welsh left the Old Bailey band, and he recommended me, along with Tello, trumpet player Tello, Ian Telfer, that is. I might be a good substitute. So I got tried out and I passed. And I was dead lucky again. I should never have got straight into what was the premier traditional jazz band in town at that time. They cleaned up all the best gigs, all the best paying gigs as well. And the only thing that you had to suffer was Mike Hart. And I say that in a jovial mood because Mike Hart has done more for jazz in this town than any other single individual, and probably any other single individual ever will.
And what age were you when you started performing sort of professionally?
Performing semi-professionally, please. The tax man might still be watching. What age? About 19, I think, by then, 18, 19. I didn't start immediately in jazz. I formed a little dance band because there seemed to be work for a dance band. It lasted for about 4 gigs, and and that was the end of it. And it was your usual dance band, it was a squeeze box piano and trumpet of all things at that time. And I suppose that was where I learned to use my right foot on the bass drum, because no bass, so you had to be tapping your foot all the time.
And what kind of venues were you playing in back in those days?
I'm ignoring the jazz band. I'm ignoring the dance band here. The jazz bands, what did we actually play in initially? Where was our first gig? Scruffy places up on Rygo Street. I never played in the West End Cafe. In fact, I was never in the West End Cafe, which was a bit of a shame because everyone else told me what a wonderful place it was, but I was never in it and I never played in it. But Rygo Street and what other places? Gosh, that's ridiculous.
Well, it's it's a few years ago.
Yes,
but
yes.
I can't remember where I've played always. What kind of people came to your gigs?
A lot of students. It was noticeable that in the students' holidays, the numbers went down quite a bit. And that persisted right up into the 70s, in fact. There were, of course, quite a lot of your average teenagers. The trad fad, as it was called at that time, had begun to develop, and that was your pop music for a short time of the younger generation. Kenny Ball and Akerbilk and people like that were drawing them in, and you only needed to be able to do a facsimile of Stranger on the Floor or something like that, and you would be popular. But
And during that period, who were you working with? Were you simply working with the one band, or were you working with different people?
No, it started off, Graham and I started off in the same band, the Savoy Jazz Band, and that was with trombone player called Bill Monroe, and trumpet players, two of them. One, Mervyn Morrison, was an Irishman, a student as well, who was a bit Irish, shall we say, and another one whose name I've forgotten. He wasn't with us for very long. Graham will be able to tell you. He knows. And this band was completed by Gerard Dott, who had joined us as a practice group. And we joined him rather because his house was handy. He lived in Cannon Lane, and we could make as much noise as we liked practically. And it was either there or in Graham's house. So Gerard and frontline trombone. Who was the trombone player? There's so many of them. Bill Monroe was the trombone player, excuse me. And let's just say Mervyn Morrison for the trumpet player, and we were okay. We got gigs. Where were these gigs? Graham has all this noted down, and he'd be able to keep you dead right on it. But I would just be guessing, frankly.
And who got the gigs? How did you get the gigs?
All of us equally got the gigs. Graham had a strong connection with the Scouts, and he got the gigs through Scout connections. And where else did they come from? Well, they came from word of mouth and from pub owners who were looking for entertainment in their bars that would be cheap. And also, and this was something I didn't realise at the time, but certainly did afterwards, or a bit later, was pub owners started using jazz bands to clear the the ne'er-do-wells out of their pubs. You know, they never liked jazz, these people, and they would go away and find another pub to drink in. So that basically was the nature of it.
And having had such a long career and been active for so many years as a musician, what are the changes that you've seen over that period?
I don't know that I saw a lot of changes, actually, because I always stayed one way or the other within the same group. You know, Archie, Old Bailey, tragically died in 1969, and for about a year the band was lost. And this figurehead, who was such a brilliant attractor of people himself, he was an adequate trombone player, but he was a marvellous band leader. And the loss of Archie left a huge hole in the band, which after an attempt or two to fill it, Kenny Ramage, for instance, was drafted in at one stage, but different personality and also different playing. Kenny was, as he said himself, played too many notes. And that was for the Dead Heath Band, never mind amateur jazz bands. But Hamish McGregor had joined us by then too. And Hamish took over. He's a natural leader in the bandstand, and he tended to take over. And he also led the band astray as far as Graham was concerned. He formed two offshoot bands, the Memphis Roadshow and, 7 Up. And 7 Up was most of the old Bailey band, with the addition of Colin Archibald on bass guitar and Johnny Fitzsimmons on guitar. And it was a quite good band, actually. And it didn't last for too long because none of Hamish's bands did. Hamish always wanted to move on and do something different. And that was the case with 7 Up anyway. But it's a pity we couldn't discuss this as a group, because that way the collective brain would do better than mine. But that was the general scheme of things at that point. So by this time, Graham, playing a string bass, he had gone his own way. He'd gone back into the folk business by then. And we didn't actually, our paths didn't cross again musically for a while. But Hamish, having given up on this about 4 years later, 3-4 years later, he phoned up one day and said, I'm reforming the old Bailey band. And that was it. You know, you'd been summoned and you were going to be there. And sure enough, it was Hamish, Andrew, and Dave Margarone at this particular stage, who was a trombone player and more modern than we were perhaps, but still he was a good player. And it was Graham, myself, and Johnny Harper. Johnny Harper began to get itchy feet. He really fancied himself as a professional musician. He still does. But he left, shall we just say. He joined a French band, l'Enfant Céleste, and went off to France. And we were left with no banjo player, but there was always looming on the horizon the person who had originally, with Archie Sinclair, formed Old Bailey's band, and that was Mike Hart. And Mike Hart was brought back into the band again because we were doing far better than his band at that time, which was the New Society Syncopators. And Mike could never understand this, but the main reason for it was that Andrew Lauder was such a powerful, well-rounded trumpet player, and he knew all the tunes. The trumpet players that Mike was getting were competent enough, but not in the same league as Andrew Lauder. So he rejoined us, and at the same time they did, well, the summer afterwards, they did a tour of America because Mike had already made contacts in Sacramento, and he was already becoming quite an important magnet figure in Edinburgh because he was the jazz festival creator. And as a result of this, the band went over, not with me or Graham. Our jobs precluded summer holidays that could extend like that. So much to my great what? Old age doesn't come alone. What's the word I want?
Chagrin.
Yes, that'll do as well as any, thank you. We couldn't go. Graham and I didn't go. And they got perfectly adequate depths to do it. They were queuing up to do it. And the one big thing I missed there was the band met Gene Krupa. And I couldn't be there to see this. And I was very, very saddened by that. My only chance to actually personally meet Gene Krupa. However, a bit later on, again due to Mike Hart, I was to meet someone who I didn't realise at the time, who was almost certainly his equal in terms of drumming technique, and that was Jake Hanna. And Jake stayed with us, and we stayed with him. We made that's my wife and I, when I'm saying we, went out to California. and an extremely likeable man and a super drummer. He could do with his right hand what very few drummers could do with two. And you learn from these people all the time. You're watching them all the time and learning. And it makes you a more desirable person to have in a band. So I was never without employment, shall we use that word again. I was always being asked to play in one group of people or another. After the Old Bailey's Jazz Advocates 2, the second time around, I was also playing on Sundays in the Barnton Hotel with another band, and I quite enjoyed it, although the trumpet player wasn't the same as Andrew Lauder, but it was a good enough band. And that was Billy Law who asked me if I would do that, because he said, I can't take any more of this guy's bazooka. And this was, the bass player had swapped instruments for curly-whirly thing, what's it called, tuba, and that was the end of him. He was a dreadful tuba player. Shouldn't speak ill of him now, because Kenny is dead, but that's Ken Burns was his name. And his band was known as the Burns Unit for that reason. But they did good business on Sunday, and again, it's just your face is being seen by many different people. In the interim, we'd left the Fountain Inn at Barnton, and Hamish had left to do other things on his own this time. And Jack Graham, who was the band's original clarinet player and a top-class player, just bone idle. If he could find a way of playing quieter, he would do it. They fitted him up with a contact mic on his clarinet. So Jack immediately discovered he could have his volume and still be heard just as well. And that's what he did. But there were stories about Jack Graham, who is also now dead, sadly. They just abounded. He was a top-class musician and clarinetist, though. And anyone that played with him, they would all say the same thing. He ended up, before he went off to Spain, playing with Jim Petrie in his quartet. You know, he was very versatile, but very, very good. And in the meantime, people like Fiona Duncan came through from Glasgow. I'm not quite sure why she came through from Glasgow the first time. She must have just heard about it on a Sunday to see the band in Platform 1. And she got up and sang with them, of course, and was immediately a hit in town. Fiona was incredibly popular at that time. And very quickly I was getting invitations to go through to Glasgow as well. And this culminated with the George Penman Band. I did a lot of depping for the George Penman Band because their drummer was a civil servant, and there were gigs that he just couldn't do, much the same as myself, but not the same ones. And I got invited by George to go up and play the opening of Silverville Oil Terminal with his band. We weren't the only band, not by a long chalk, but he was just, I think he was the required jazz band at the time. And went up there, and his trumpet player, Gordon Dillon, was a lovely wee guy. Glasgow cartoon fat, and great singer of his own type, and played the trumpet really well too. He was the only one that I could compare with Andrew Lauder in terms of feeling easy playing with him. And George, trombone player was George, oh dear, put me under pressure, and I knew this was going to happen. George, trombone player, still alive, still playing at times. Dear, this is where I should have Graham making signs. It's not. I'm immediately thinking George Kerr. No, not George Kerr. It's George. You can cut this out. I
Oh, of
take it.
course.
Yeah, well, that's fine.
Don't worry.
I can leave bigger spaces then. George Kidd. You've heard of him, I take it, yeah. And George Kidd was a top-class trombone player, but not as good by that time as the one that we had introduced into the Old Bailey band via Mike Hart's band. Mike Hart had one gem in his band, and that was Johnny McGuff, trombone player, again now dead sadly, but he was a fabulous trombone player. And he was easily good enough to have made the London scene in the big time. You know, he could have, but he couldn't be bothered. He was on a quite happy scene up here. So you had George Kidd in Glasgow and you had Johnny McGuff in Edinburgh, but Johnny was the best one. So by that time, our band, I refer to always as our band, the Old Bailey's Jazz Advocates, was, I think, in a league of its own. Andrew was probably his most powerful. And, Johnny McGuff was just priceless. And clarinet at that time, again, was Hamish, who decided that maybe it was a band to get back into again. And Mike Hart was there, of course. And a lot of people think that I really have it in for Mike Hart. I don't. I really consider Mike to have done more for jazz in Edinburgh than anybody else. And the only thing wrong with him was he was a banjo player. And it wasn't just a banjo. It was a very loud banjo. And he eventually worked himself into the front line of the band. He'd be standing there, any picture, any photograph you see of the band, Mike's there at the front with his flaming banjo. And that was where I would have preferred him because you couldn't hear it quite so much. But he was so dominant, and he was also so totally convinced that he was right. As far as time was concerned, his idea of perfect time was the right one. Now, unfortunately, that's what I felt too, because I felt drummers, that's what they should do. And we had a few squabbles, and that's really where we tended to diverge. However, Mike was at his worst when he was smoking the wacky backy, as we called it, and it proved to me at that time that no form of drugs does you any good whatsoever as far as playing's concerned. It only makes you think you're playing well, but it doesn't help you at all. However, I can see these sort of things about Mike because he sadly has gone now too.
We talked a bit about, that you described yourself as a semi-professional, I suppose. Was it possible for anyone to make a living out of playing jazz in Scotland?
Edinburgh? Yes, well, there were. By that time, there were people coming through who were making a bit of a living, at least, doing that, in that they never did anything else. But what sort of living they made? An ex-pupil of mine at school, I don't mean as a drummer, Dave Swanson, is still doing nothing other than teaching drumming and playing gigs. And very, very good drummer. He was a core drummer initially, but he got brought under my influence quick enough to realise that core drumming on its own, although very handy for developing rudiments, was useless for actually developing a playing style. And I still see Dave now and again, and he's still playing very well. Who else? Well, Alex Shaw, of course. Alex Shaw was quite simply the best pianist around. And the reason that Edinburgh has so many good pianists in it is because of Alex Shaw. They had him to actually aspire to. And I'm a strong believer in this. It's the same basis. Ronnie Ray established standards for bass playing, and there's a load of others who are just doing their best to copy him or to emulate him at least. And other instruments, well, not so much, but these were the two that struck out for me. I didn't have a local drummer that I was concentrating on copying, if you like, but I did have one or two Americans who I was very lucky to see. Both Graham and I went to see the Count Basie Band first it was, and the Duke Ellington Band. And that was just a wake-up call, you know, just the way these people performed, the light and shade and everything. And Hamish, who was leading the band by this time he came back, light and shade became what we were all concentrating on. You would do a lot of the big rim shots and right down to nothing, lads, nothing. And we've got quite good at that too. There was a lot of these sort of ploys that you could easily take from the professionals, I mean the top class professionals, and realise, you know, this isn't too difficult to do. You just got to all do it at the same time. And it made it more interesting constantly. You were being challenged yourself all the time too. I thoroughly enjoyed that. That was my period of playing, which I think I most enjoyed. Right now, if you're to say, and when was that, I don't think I could tell you. I think it was probably the first half of the 80s. By that time, trad jazz had disappeared completely, and traditional jazz bands were only popular if they had gimmicks even, let's say. They had to have something that made them desirable for a general public. Although we could still fill pubs, you have to bear in mind that we weren't, that they weren't charging. You know, they were charging in terms of inflating the price of beer and drink, but that was the only way in which they were being charged, and people were quite happy to pay an extra couple of bob or what have you, and a pint of beer, you know, to come in and listen. So that was something, but that, for me, that finished a bit later on in a pub, a very scruffy place called Basin Street at the West End. And you had a bar downstairs, and you had the place where the band was playing upstairs, which was a penny a pint dearer. You know, that was the sort of situation. But still with that, you had people who were going downstairs to get their pint and coming back upstairs with it. I just thought, no, I don't need this anymore. So we gave up. I gave up at that, at least.
I mean, I think we've covered most of the bases, Chick.
I hope so.
But if we could maybe finish by, have you got one sort of standout moment in all of your years as playing that really sticks in your memory, or something that happened along the way, or
one
or two?
Well, does it have to be a stick-out playing memory, or can it just be a memory? One of the memories I'll never forget was we were playing some gig somewhere north of Edinburgh, I can't even remember where, but also we were accompanying very much on the bill the band, Alex Welsh's band, which had in it at that time Lenny Hastings, the great Lenny Hastings, who I'd never heard in the flesh at that point. And Lenny Hastings was in a car. They had two cars, and the car he was in with, I forget who else, was delayed. And Alex came up and asked me, would you like to play with the band for a little while till Lenny gets here? You know, this is me, Alex Welsh, that's a big jump. So I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then Lenny had set his kit up behind the stage, behind the curtain on the stage, and I was told at the end of this number, you'll be moving your kit back, and Lenny will bring his kit forward. Won't take long, and he did. And I had to sit there, taking my drum kit apart quietly, listening to this man playing the drums like I just didn't believe was possible. I was the equivalent of the man who had to paint the skirting boards in the Sistine Chapel. You know, it was just chalk and cheese. Lenny was just something else. He was nuts as well, mind you, but he was unbelievable player. And not just Lenny. Same thing happened in a different way. No, there's no point going into. There's just so many, as I say, like that.